have with me Brian Writer, a very old friend of mine. We've been in the tea trade together for years, but I'm going to ask you, Brian, on this particular occasion, about the tea trade dinner, which again, you and I both were very involved in for many years.
Yes, it was a gathering originally and mostly at the Savoy for the industry here in UK. Obviously the brokers playing a major part, London brokers, but as the years progressed we had more and more visitors from overseas who came to see what was happening in London. The speeches generally were very good. There were one or two exceptions, I think, which I won't mention. Particularly one particular blending house, the gentleman was talking about tea bags and spent the whole of his speech talking about how well the company had done with tea bags. I should not be nameless. And I was sitting on another major UK blender, and they were less than happy with the comments that the chairman was actually making, rather indicating that they were the only company in UK that was packing tea. It was an interesting time. You had very relaxed, and you were able to talk to many people that you would only just come across in passing. And I think a lot of information was forthcoming, and I think everybody gained knowledge, particularly when we had producers coming in from India and Sri Lanka. You heard some of the problems that they were having firsthand, which gave you an indication what was likely to happen in the future, because quite frankly, as much information as you could gain, it would have an advantage to you, particularly if you were blending in UK. So we had it mainly at the Savoy. It restarted just after the war, very successfully. It was we continued until the Savoy was sold to the present owners, and we moved to the banqueting.
We did, Brian, but just going back a bit, of course, for many, many years, it was at the Connaught Rooms.
That's right.
And it's because the Connaught Rooms had a fire and couldn't accommodate us that year that we moved to the Savoy in 1976.
Yes, you're right. Yes. Because the Connaught Rooms at their stage had their own kitchens. But after, as Mike said, after the fire, we moved to Savoy. One of my jobs, before I actually became chairman, was to work with the staff to provide the tea at the end of the dinner. And in those days, they were mostly Italian. They had a core of established senior waiters, and I worked with them, and my great bone of contention was they would use water boilers, and I eventually persuaded them to use kettles where you had actually used boiling water, because the first pot from a boiler came out well brewed. The second one, of course, the water was not boiling, and therefore, in my opinion, it was not up to the standard that we should have at Savoy. So I spent 4 or 5 years, and I got to know the Italian staff very well, and I hope that the tea that was provided was up to a reasonable standard.
You did a brilliant job, Brian, on that, because the thing was that originally it was always coffee served after the dinner, and the tea trade committee said, this is crazy, it's a tea trade dinner, so we decided to start serving tea.
Yeah.
But as you say, they hadn't a clue.
No.
And you really mastered them, and by the end of it they were producing some very good tea. Hotels find tea difficult for obvious reasons, if it's got to be done properly, but Brian did a great job, and we've been drinking lovely tea after the dinner ever since.
Yeah, good. So I think that's a very short introduction.
Yes, Brian, I think that covers. Brian and I both go back a long way, and we both remember when we used to go down to the old warehouses on the Thames to look at all the teas, where they came in for many, many years. Brian, you've got an interesting book there, and perhaps tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, we're looking. I'm looking at a picture of St Catherine's Dock, which again was one of the major importers of tea. In those days, of course, the tea was offloaded down at Tilbury and came up in barges, So all the warehouses, both on the north and the south side of the Thames, up to Tower Bridge, were of course tea warehouses. The system was extremely good. The barges came up, the chests, although the chests were lifted out into the sections, the openings in the warehouse for weighing. They had a whole team of dockers working within the warehouse, putting 2 chests on a barrow. They were lifted off. They were then sorted into marks and grades and weighed and stacked. There was a real industry. It was a hive of activity. And if ever you went in when they were working, you stood well back, because they knew exactly what they were doing, and you were just going to be a nuisance. When, of course, we had containerization, London, of course, was found not to be suitable, particularly the warehouses up towards the Tower Bridge, and therefore, sadly, they are still retained, but they have become luxury flats. I think that's probably a very short description. We lost, and Lyons particularly lost, because all their tea came up in barges up to Greenford, and they stored their tea for manufacture in their own dock at Greenford. But of course, when that stopped, they then had to look round to find other warehouses that would stock their tea. There was obviously, when the tea arrived, it was a whole new process of preparing it for auction. The teas were weighed, and a weight note was produced. Samples were drawn from the particular lot. They were put on trays. That each chest had the sample was taken from each chest, laid out on a wooden chest, which the tea inspectors from the selling brokers went down to inspect and advise if there was any irregularity within that particular 20 or 40 chests of tea. They were then taken and they were tasted by the selling broker staff in preparation of auction. There was a lot of skill. The warehouse staff in the brokers were able to look at a tray of tea and say whether there was any irregularity. If there was, then they had to be reblended again. But generally, the standard of grading was extremely good. They were then tasted, and it was prepared for the auction. So they were very reliant on the dockers, A, to get the tea into the warehouse, and B, for the staff of the selling brokers to check that the tea that was being offered was up to a standard.
Very good, Brian. No, I think you've covered that brilliantly. Just one small thing I will say, of course, that dock goes back much earlier than our time, way back, of course, to tea clippers and all the rest of it, when the great clipper races came bringing the new China crop to London. So it has a tremendous history, and it's a fabulous place to visit today.
Yes, yeah.
Brian, going back to the warehouses, you, like me, have spent a lot of time visiting them, and I'd be very interested to hear if you've got a couple of amusing anecdotes about what went on.
Well, Metropolitan Warehouse, big warehouse in Crutched Friars, and tea pilfering was a way of life for many underpaid staff in brokers and buyers' offices. And the arrangement was that there were 2 or 3 guys in the warehouse. They needed to move tea quickly. And the way they managed it there is that in Metropolitan, until quite recently, bonded warehouse, it had used huge 4-inch rainwater pipes from the roof down to the pavement. And one guy was on the roof and poured the tea down the pipe, and the other guy was standing underneath the sack. and they worked out that they had one sack would fill the sack at the bottom. They also had 2 people on guard, one was top of Crutted Friars and one at the bottom, to look out for the local police, who were these days extremely active. But an awful lot of tea was removed from the warehouse without any problem at all.
Did this come out of chests that were, as we used to call them, part damaged?
I think so,
Yes,
part damaged.
it had to, otherwise it would,
yes,
somebody
yes.
would have soon got
There was
the hang of what
there-
was happening.
There would always seem to be chests that got broken when they were being stored. But as I say, the other way, of course, is if you could remove the bung from a chest with a suitable sack or thing, you could get quite a lot of tea out of it without anybody realising they had been, having been weighed. It wasn't until the bar went to the warehouse and re-weighed them to find that he was short of tea. That was another very, very handy way of doing it, because the each chest was bored and a bung was put in, and it wasn't difficult if you knew how to get the bung out again. Give it a good kick into a bucket, and then bung the bung back in again, and quietly just walk through as nothing had happened.
Incredible, Brian. Yes, and when you think that in those days, 3-day auctions, we were probably selling between 60 and 90,000 chests of tea a week in the height of the Indian season.
Yeah.
An awful lot of tea for people
Yes.
to take not a lot out of and make a nice living.
Yeah, well, Steve, our sales manager in Thomas Cumbridge, he had a fine business going in Billingsgate, because all the staff had a pound of tea wrapped in greaseproof, which Margaret was delighted, doing a lot of cooking. And it was a long time before I realised that he got his own business running. He used to get up there about 6 o'clock, and he had a colleague with him, and they used to barrow the spare tea wrapped in greaseproof paper. And of course, I asked him why when I got to know him, which took a while because I was different from his way of life. And it wasn't until I walked into the sale room on one occasion, fell over a tea chest and used the F word as I fell flat on my face. After that, we got on quite well. I was more than accepted as part of the furniture. But of course, he said, all the fish is wrapped up in greaseproof paper. He said, I don't have any trouble with the bobbins, and I'm wheeling around. And I thought, you've got it right.
I thought you were going to say he did a trade bartering fish for tea.
Well, he probably did.
Possibly did.
I've no idea. When the nuns used to come up, I mean, they were classic. They used to go around to all the brokers' offices and ask for tea, for the convent. And one used to see them in the afternoon, about half a dozen of them, staggering along Eastcheap, and you could just see underneath their gowns a sort of, looked like a piece of paper. They'd probably got about 8 sacks of tea, which they were taking back to the convent.
Yes, that was all very genuine.
Oh, yes.
Our 2 tea inspectors were almost the same height as the nuns, and there was always the joke when the nuns came into our cell and they said, oh, here come our tea inspectors again dressed up. Anyway, all good stuff. Thank you, Brian. Most interesting.